First off, apologies for the long content break. New job, final year in college, and a slew of responsibilities made it so I had neither the time or drive for this YouTube shtick. Hopefully, I will upload more regularly now. With all that being said, let's get this show on the road. In the hierarchy of cream of the crop indie games, Supergiant occupies the space of nearly peerless art direction combined with creative gameplay concepts. First off, we had Bastion, a somewhat slower paced hack and slash game about a post-apocalyptic fantasy world. The strong characterization with powerful thematically relevant music made a relatively straightforward story quite endearing. It was rightfully deserving of its sleeper hit status. Then came the sci-fi adventure Transistor. The music and presentation was just as good as Bastion, if not better, but Supergiant aimed higher while not necessarily reaching their mark. The story was a lot more vague than necessary, since it all leads to a baby's first Philip K. Dick with some truly saccharine moments, and the gameplay was this unwieldy compromise between turn-based and action combat that resulted in a lot of downtime running around in circles waiting for a bar to fill. I am still unsure after 3 years if I slightly dislike it or slightly like it. So let us say we are 1 for 1 in terms of Supergiant's accomplishments, at least in my opinion. Now we have a new game launched. What is it about? Well, ever wonder what it's like to lead a band of exiles across a land chock full of mythology to compete in a religiously themed game of basket rugby ball with energy attacks, in hopes of achieving enlightenment and escaping fantasy Australia? Me neither, but mix all of that in, and a heavy dose of visual novel elements with a JRPG cast straight from your childhood, and voila, what you have is Pyre. To be honest, I was quite hyped, mainly because I like RPGs, and one of my biggest gripes with them is how often they fall back on using combat as their core experience. Even the games that tout as being about choice and consequence still have you fighting most of the time. So having a sports-themed fantasy RPG seemed like a twist that really shouldn't surprise anyone. You still have 3-dimensional objects moving to and away from each other, with interactions that result in some of the said objects getting removed at different intervals. Hell, Pyre even comes with its own energy attack. The main difference here is that an environmental factor is the key to victory, rather than removing as many enemy objects on the screen as possible. Basically, what I'm saying is that RPGs should try to do something else besides combat, and even something like sports, which isn't even that far from traditional fighting, is a breath of fresh air. But that is only half or even less of the experience. The main thing that you're going to do is reading text. Lots and lots and lots of text. Which is rather apt because you are the reader, a member of a society called the Commonwealth, in which literacy is forbidden, so that earns you a one-way trip into political purgatory, aka the downside. As luck would have it, you are found by a set of exiles who need someone who can read, because this means they can use a book who gives a team of 3 access to sports matches based on the journeys of a religious figure and the possibility to climb in the League of the Land, which in turn nets you the chance to play in a winner-takes-all showdown where someone might earn their freedom. I swear to God, it is impossible to plainly explain what the hell is going on in this game. Which really shouldn't be the case. You hook up with a bunch that rescues you, and then you go from point A to point B for the purpose of playing matches while solving minor events. Sometimes picking up new teammates, but most of the time experiencing a metric ton of deepest lore that's either being drip-fed by other characters or the Book of Rights that allows participation in the sports matches. For all its weirdness, this is a rather direct experience from start to finish. You read the text for like 20 minutes, maybe take a decision that causes some small statistical change, then play a match, rinse and repeat for 10 to 15 hours. And while I can see that all the minutiae surrounding this game was thought out long in advance, and while I can see that someone poured their heart and soul into this vibrant, colorful world filled with some top-tier character design, and while I can see that the designer must have really liked the sports game, I can't really call myself a fan of Supergiant's Pyre. Mainly because the moving parts and pieces that make this experience are surprisingly uneven. The game takes forever to get the ball rolling, so to speak. It took me 13 hours to finish this game, and out of those 5 were spent in the first cycle of matches, where every team was introduced and every round, meaning 8, were mostly just victory laps won with the greatest of ease. And even after the game starts proper, it doesn't really fully start. The additional difficulty modifiers that Supergiant is known for take a while to truly gather up in something that could be used to properly tweak your experience, and the feature of doing specific actions during matches to gain currency shows up at the halfway point. It's baffling how much this game drags when it comes to introducing its gameplay properly. And sadly, even when it reaches that point, I can hardly say it's impressive. Beginning with the camera. You know how in movies, if the editing is good, nobody says anything, but if it's bad, everybody shouts at the editor? Well, the cameras in games, especially 3-dimensional ones, are exactly like that. There are so many games that are made fantastic by the dynamic use of the camera. In fact, most big companies, if you want to get a job as an expert gameplay programmer, they will probably hit you with camera work to see what you can do. In essence, gameplay programmers and game designers should take this maxim to heart when implementing a camera. The camera must help the next decision, not the current one. Notice in the football game FIFA how pulled back the camera is and how smooth the edge of the screen pans. There is a reason for this. When doing camera work for your game, you want to establish your point of relationship. This is 99% of the time what the player controls. Then, everything that you want them to keep an eye on / interact with is their point of focus. Whether it is a character, a squad, or a crosshair, the main idea is that you want the camera to always help the player in deciding what they want to do, rather than focusing on what they're doing at the moment. Sports games in particular have a tough challenge represented by shifting points of relationship. Since the player switches between characters in real time, the player needs to be cognizant of each possible pass, and then possible implications of the situation of the new character he controls. Thus, sports games have generally slow, very zoomed out cameras that allow the player to observe the field in the fractions of a second during downtime, such as when the ball is going from one character to another. Now let's take Pyre. This is how fast a round can end.
And it is done.
And also keep in mind that passes between characters are instantaneous. The result is that the camera is far too close to account for the speed here. Take a look at the edges of a screen during the game in comparison to FIFA. It is too jittery. There are so many moments of high action where the ball gets passed around in quick succession followed by attacks and banishments. This results in situations where it takes a second for the players to get their bearings and they lose control of the game, which is the hallmark of a bad camera system. What surprises me here the most is how visible this camera issue is. The only possible motivation I can imagine is that the camera being this zoomed in was a conscious decision since character models vary widely, and some are really small. And if that was the intention, congratulations, the character models are well done and highly visible, but the gameplay suffers in return. I don't think that is a trade you ever want to make. And sadly, the camera isn't the only issue preventing a smooth play experience. Supergiant really wanted the players to shift through all the characters. You see, enemies level up with you, and when you win a liberation right, then you get to release one of your high-level teammates, leaving you with the weaker ones, so you are encouraged to keep a relatively balanced team amount of experience. All of this wouldn't be so bad if the characters weren't so mechanically different. They move and attack in different ways, which when combined with their particular skill trees results in quite a few idiosyncrasies that simply do not make this game pick up and play. Plus, the fact that the matches are separated so heavily by the visual novel aspect takes away from the focus of the player on the feel of the game. Each time I made drastic roster changes, I'd fumble about for the better part of the match trying to remember who does what. This simple ball game with energy attacks should have been the highlight, but instead it is fundamentally flawed in terms of pacing and camera. It just doesn't feel good to run around the field and score points. So if the gameplay is such a disappointment, then what about the other parts, such as the writing? Well, in terms of expressing oneself and setting a mood, I think Supergiant can be safely called competent. Very rarely did I find something that annoyed me out of the experience because of how a sentence was formed or how a word was used. Unfortunately, that's not enough due to so much of the experience being focused on said writing. Overall, I'd ask, what was the point of this game? You have a prison setting, of which admittedly I am a huge fan of, and the implication of stirring up political revolution. Pretty heavy stuff that the characters seem to take seriously, but closer inspection shows how this premise chafes against the somewhat cartoony tone. Most of the characters you meet have a section in their bio which at some point reveals what their crime was for ending up in the downside. And the vast majority of them are victims of political activism or framed or actually innocent. There are no characters with hard crimes that you would expect to meet in a jail setting. Stuff like arson, murder, pedophilia, human trafficking, you know, legitimately horrifying stuff. So that kinda takes off the edge of the political nature of the game. It just doesn't feel honest, so to speak, with this saccharine jail where you don't meet people with grave crimes. So let us say that this isn't the focus of the game, but rather the mystical angle. You have this whole Siddhartha Gautama style storyline of a fallen aristocrat that becomes a religious figurehead, rallies acolytes and brings order. The sport around which the entire game is centered is based on his travels, and this sport is supposed to bring enlightenment. That is what experience points are called in this game. This enlightenment is supposed to show one's worthiness towards getting their freedom. Just one problem. Nobody, and I mean nobody, actually changes due to the rituals. If you read the biographies of everyone you meet, they are the exact same person they were before reaching the downside and playing the ritual game. If they were a spiritual fellow condemned for worshipping, then he continues to be like that. If he was a violent thug before, he continues to be like that after. The whole spiritual journey these characters are supposedly undergoing feels like an absolute joke, especially when the rules are broken and teams get away with it. But the rituals are shown to have magical effects, and there are these two beings that watch over the games who I think are supposed to be the avatars of the moon and sun, it isn't very clear. Regardless, they are clearly higher beings, and with such guardians you would think that blatantly disrespecting the rituals or actually cheating would have some ramifications rather than none at all. I mean, even the referee leaves at one point due to all the rule bending going on.
He cannot simply claim it now. And I cannot preside over this nonsense. Good night.
So yes, both the political angle and the mystical angle fail. What is left? Well, the character journeys, and I think this is what the writers were going for the most. It is the crux of the game, due to the fact that the entire plot is centered around deciding who gets to go free and the heavy consequences this has on the entire team. And you can mess up. This is a game that allows the player to feel the full weight of their failures by acknowledging every single in-game loss. And you can theoretically lose all of them, with the story having an outcome centered around this. No matter what choices you make or challenges you win or lose, each player shall have an ending where you get to see what happens to everyone, and I do mean everyone. So the focus on the characters is more than clear. You are meant to empathize with them, you are meant to help one choose if he should have a mustache or not, you are meant to find a vagabond and name her, bonding with her in that way. I get that, and I think that Pyre does work as a character-centric game in the end, but not good enough for me, and I admit that this might be a bit of a personal point. I dislike how there are no shades of subtlety to any character, how a character is presented in their first line of dialogue is 100% representative of the entire experience. If they are good-natured and sociable, that is exactly how they are, and if they are strong and silent, that is exactly how they are, and of course, the crimes reflect this. I'm not saying every character needs to have complexity. For example, Sir Gilman is a super enthusiastic knight and he works well as an over-the-top character. But in my opinion, some people needed a plot twist or a change of heart during the story to make the cast more interesting. Especially since the roster is filled with stereotypes and there is a serious case of been here done that, at least for me. There is also the issue of the writers being unsure if the main character is the player or someone else. For example, there is a mysterious sleeping man at the beginning of the game in the wagon in which you travel. The protagonist just notices and then ignores this, with no option to ask your companions about this man. This was a moment where I was definitely taken out of the experience, because who would just ignore a mysterious man in the place they sleep without inquiring about him? It is a matter of the world working on writers' fiat rather than organic interactions between characters. The same issue applies to the fact that your team, the Nightwings, have a very special role that everyone knows about, but every single companion and rival you encounter neglect to even make a passing mention until the story decides to reveal this fact. And suddenly everyone's making references left and right. See what I mean? That's pretty much what we call bad writing. In the end, I can't say I find the writing and the world produced here by Supergiant highly enjoyable. Which is a damn shame considering how much better they did in Bastion and hell, even Transistor. There would be more to say here, like why is the downside so unlivable anyway, and the whole shtick with the Fall Cthulhu Titan beings, but that would be beating a dead horse. Point is, the game lacks cohesion. Which isn't to say there aren't merits. I like that the characters are accurately aware of the game mechanics of this world and directly mention them, or how the wiki-style hyperlinks are used to give player information in a compact manner, something which appears in last year's Tyranny RPG as well. Honestly, I wouldn't mind the widespread use of this particular feature. So the game does do some stuff well, just not enough of them. Look, I know I'm being negative. I really wanted to like this game. Supergiant is one of the few, let us say, auteur studios around. They have a really solid core development team that does have interesting ideas and some clear thematic influences they want to share. But all the goodwill in the world can make me overlook this game's rather deep flaws. Oh, and the music, by the way, what the hell happened here? This is by far the weakest showing in what was Supergiant's forte. Both Bastion and Transistor have amazing soundtracks that actually intertwine with this game's narrative elements. It is not just good music, but actually meaningful to the story. While Pyre does do the same thing, it feels a lot more routine and soulless. At one point, one of the characters says to the minstrel, "Hey, play a song," and then he plays a song. Pretty far from the dramatic moments in the other games where the vocal tracks kicked in. Not to mention situations like the Liberation Rite track, that sounds very good when I listen to it on YouTube and not during the actual game, due to how cluttered and noisy the game effects are during a match. Top tier audio work, guys. It would be harsh to say that Pyre is not worth at least one playthrough. It has a level of development competency missing from the vast majority of indie titles. And it does have an interesting premise as well as some interesting design choices. Unfortunately, it is also a classic case of excellent idea, mediocre execution. My final thoughts while listening to the ending credits song about the journey these characters undertook was one of unfulfilled potential. Much like some of the endings my characters got, either being cut short in their journey or left behind. I am not quite sure this was the feeling Supergiant wanted to leave behind after finishing Pyre, but c'est la vie. We can only hope that their next project will rise to the bar that they themselves set with their previous works.